You're watching Mideast Realities. This is our weekly program on the realities of what's happening in the Middle East. This particular week, the realities of what's happening in Washington, D.C. about the Middle East. We're at the offices of the Council for the National Interest. Gene Bird, someone I've known a long time, someone who's been active in Middle East affairs for a very long time, including in the Foreign Service and in the private business sector, I believe. We're at their offices near 16th and K Street, and we're discussing the realities of what's really taking place in Washington. Let's get to the realities of CNI. You talked about the new Congress, and you're going to put forward some legislation, meaning you're going to lobby
well, we aren't going to put forward. We're going to try and inspire
in the Congress.
Yeah, we're going to try and inspire.
That puts you up against, of course, the infamous Israeli Jewish lobby.
Yes.
Now, is it really fair that you portray yourselves to supporters as sort of an alternative to that lobby when, I mean, it's sort of the,
let me point
one
out,
is the elephant and one is the mouse?
That's true, but let me say this. I was talking with a staff member on the Hill the other day, and I said, you know, it does seem to me that we have a real problem here. In the next 3 years, we want to phase out aid completely, because on the 50th anniversary of Israel's independence, in 1998, we want to have all official aid ended because she's the 16th most wealthy country in the world. There's no reason to make a welfare case out of her. She's gotten on welfare and she's stayed on welfare, and this is the result. Now,
no, there's another result. Israel does, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out repeatedly, covert and overt work that the United States wants done in the region. The most important thing the United States wants done, it wants the regimes that sit in Amman, in Riyadh, in Cairo, and as many other places as possible to stay in power. And the Israelis cooperate with us under the table, using Mossad, using their intelligence capabilities, using their military when necessary, to keep that situation going up. So let's deal with the realities of it.
No, but there's another effect, Mark, that we haven't discussed too, and that is that the corruption in connection with the U.S. aid program to Israel is endemic. There's no way, when you give money at this level to a small country, and it has so many different political parties, and they are all concerned with the gravy train. And you know how Israeli politics work. Furthermore, we have the same problem up here on the Hill.
And we look the other way because we know that the Israelis, on the whole, are doing things that the American government thinks are in the national interests of the United States.
And which turn out to be such things as the Iran-Contra affair, the Dotan affair, the stealing of plutonium for the number of incidents, the Pollard affair. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
But you could look at it the other way.
Yes.
You could say, our regimes are still in place in Amman, in Riyadh, in Cairo, and that is a success for American policy.
Yeah, I don't agree with you that Israel is behind our attempts to keep the regimes in power. There's a much deeper stability to some of the regimes, including the one in Saudi Arabia, than you're suggesting here. They're not being kept in power because of either the United States or Israel. But that's a subject for another.
And certainly a very important aspect of the national interests of the United States.
Yes, and we will be getting into that eventually. But our first objective, we've got to keep focused on one issue and one objective, and that is the objective of ending the terribly passionate attachment that has it.
I'm not convinced of that, Gene. I'm not convinced that the Council for the National Interest is not being disingenuous with this idea that there is this one huge, terrible problem, and it's so important, so terrible, we have to deal with it to the exclusion of all the others.
This is where we start. This is where we start the road. The road we start on is to end the aid program to Israel.
We just destroyed Iraq. We just destroyed Iraq. Did the Council for the National Interest involve itself in that issue? Well,
some of our board of directors tried to prevent that war from happening. Others of them were quite, well, they shrugged their shoulders and said, Saddam is Saddam is Saddam. And
the same Saddam they've been meeting with for the last 10 years.
Yes, but I would point out that Israel, I was talking with the top intelligence official in Israel less than a year ago, and he praised Saddam to the point that I said to him, what I'm hearing is that Israel could make a deal with Saddam Hussein. Now remember, this is only about 15 months ago. And he looked down and he said, yes, I think we could.
I think he might even have been sending a message from you.
I think he might.
But we both this is Mideast realities, and that's, I always bring us back to realities. That's because, not because
you're going to be the only person in the world that creates realities about the Middle East if you succeed in this.
Success, that's another discussion. But attempting to bring forward the realities of the situation, let's take this situation right here. Why is Israel interested in Saddam? Because Iraq's already been destroyed, its military power, it's already been crushed. The real enemy, as recognized in the last couple years, the reason for the deal in Gaza with Yasser Arafat, the real enemy we call the fundamentalists. The real enemy is Iran. The real enemy is populist, nationalist, Islamic, grassroots fundamentalism. Yep. And the boogeyman in the 60s...
That's the view from Israel, it's the view from...
And from Washington.
And yes, that's true. That's true.
Under those conditions, if they have to make a deal with Saddam Hussein to go after Iran, which of course it was the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait which encouraged Saddam to attack Iran shortly after the revolution in 1980 anyway. I mean, let's call it straight. There are no friendships between big powers and between countries. There are relationships. Those relationships can change overnight if, in fact, people make choices. Saddam made the choice to invade Kuwait. He thought he had the green light, just like the Israelis had the green light from Alexander Haig when they invaded Lebanon.
Do you think there was actually a green light sent by the United States?
If the ambassador of the United States came into my office, and I know April Glaspie, so do you, if she came into my office and I had 100,000 troops on the border with Kuwait and she told me, we have no view on border disputes between you and Kuwait and other Arab border disputes in the region. Yes, I think it was reasonable for him to conclude that that was the green light.
She was under instruction not to get the United States involved in a border dispute. I mean, that was the problem.
Border dispute was already there. The 100,000 troops were sitting on the border, and the last 2 years of economic and oil policies were purposefully designed to create antagonism.
Let me ask you this. There are people in the Middle East who think that the Iran-Iraq war was really started by a combination of Mossad and the United States intelligence agencies.
Are you turning the tables on me now, and you're going to ask me a question?
Exactly. What do you think about that? I mean,
I think that's correct.
That's a beginning point.
I think when
I remember I was called that night that it happened by an Iranian who was very close to the generals, and said, "We've done it. We've done it. We're going to establish an Iranian state and bring the Shah's son back in." And
my judgment would be, that the Israelis throughout the 80s were terribly worried about the buildup of Iraqi forces, this hardened army, this battle-weary army of 1 million men.
They turned them east, you mean?
They tried a number of times. There was the big gun. There was the British journalist who might have been intelligence official who was killed.
They attacked the...
Then when the Kuwaiti situation came about, you know how our government works. We've got intelligence profiles, psychological profiles. We've been infiltrating these regimes ever since they were created. We've got very sophisticated analysts, as the Israelis do, who know how to manipulate these people.
And yet they continue to surprise us.
So you asked me the question. I'm going to give you my answer, which cannot be proved. I believe Mossad and CIA elements in our own country manipulated that conflict between the United States and Iraq, and I think it could have gone either way. The government of the United States could have decided we need to work with the Iraqis, they're the future, they're secular, they're not a monarchist regime. It went the other way. Certainly the Israelis, if this analysis is correct, were a big weight on the side of the United States must destroy Iraq. And I think we're heading in that direction with Iran. We've got a map of the world up here, actually. I think the Iranians represent a very serious threat. They've been strangled economically and politically. They're not the kind of threat that can bomb Tel Aviv. They are the kind of threat that can set off waves of nationalist and fundamentalist revolution in places like Sudan, in places like Algeria, in places like Gaza. And I think the Israelis and the Americans are now...
And Lebanon.
I think this deal, this peace process, to use the language that in many ways we should find another alternative for, this deal is very much about how do we restructure the Middle East against the nationalist, fundamentalist forces that took over in Iran, that have taken over in Sudan, that threaten in Cairo, that threaten in Algeria.
But you know, this is macro strategic that you're talking about here, and I'd rather get back. I want to keep focused on just this Israeli-Palestinian thing.
Then I'll ask the questions, you do the answers, and we'll talk about CNI again.
I really think that the Palestinians and the Israelis, as one of the Palestinians said to me, you know, if we ever have real peace, we're going to dominate the Middle East, the Israelis and the Palestinians together. You've heard it. Now, my question is, how do we get to that point where these highly talented people, the Palestinians and the Israelis, very, very close to us in many, many ways. We have something like maybe 300,000 Palestinians here in the United States today. And as you know, there are about 2.5 million Muslims in the United States, plus another 3 million indigenous Muslims.
Let's talk about how we get there, because in my view, we're further away now. The tension when you travel between Palestine and Israel across the Green Line, the tension of coming in as a Jew or an Israeli is worse now than it was 10 years ago. Or in East Jerusalem. Just look at, you know, everyone is... there are no physical boundaries, but the psychological and security boundaries have gotten even worse. And my thesis would be that if you force people into prostituting political arrangements, if you lie and misrepresent what you're doing long enough, if you beat, torture, subject people to humiliation and take away their dignity. It's done with U.S. aid, with U.S. resources. It's done with U.S. aid, with U.S. bullets, with U.S. guns. And where did Hamas come from? There wasn't a Hamas 10 years ago. No, and of course they invented Hamas, or they encouraged Hamas. In the beginning. Against Arafat. And they did the same thing in Lebanon, where they had Amal, and suddenly Amal got very fed up with the Israeli occupation and sort of disappeared, and the radicals came to power in southern Lebanon, the Hezbollah. And let's not forget, right here at home, the trade towers blew up. We had a security alert in this city, Memorial Bridge, just the other night. They didn't give us all the details, but I know that they closed down that bridge for hours and hours and hours and had frogmen all over the place because somebody called in a credible bomb threat. This town, in the years that you and I have lived here, has turned from a fairly easygoing place to a place with security at every step of the way. And of course, that's the real problem with the peace process in the West Bank. And this is what this pilgrimage addressed more than anything else. We said the removal of the closures and the fact that the main hospital in East Jerusalem, Augusta Victoria Hospital, which has been traditionally the main Palestinian hospital, it's the Hadassah of the Palestinians. They are being hassled to the point where they are going to have to go out of business probably, unless someone pours a lot of money in there. And there'll probably be a nice Israeli hotel there. And there'll probably be a nice, it's a very nice location. A very nice location, right next to the Hebrew University. My point is this. I talked with an Israeli Knesset member, and I told them about all of the experiences we had. And we were, you know, tourists and so on and so forth. The guards coming aboard and waving their guns around and so on. You have to, when you go from Bethlehem through Jerusalem to Ramallah, a distance of 10 miles, you go, excuse me, you go through 4 checkpoints, a minimum. And it can be as many as 6. And that's what we're trying to do with this program. You're listening to Mideast Realities. You're watching and listening to Mideast Realities. The purpose of this program is to try to get to the underlying realities. What's happening in the Middle East? What's the real situation? What's happening in Washington? What's the real situation with American policy? Those realities, unfortunately, are not very well represented in the American mainstream press. Not on McNeil-Lehrer, not in the New York Times. Both Gene and I have been involved in these matters for a long time. We have our perspectives, but here we're talking about the peace process and agreeing very clearly that tension between Palestinians and Israelis is greater now than it was 10 years ago. Greater now after this agreement than it was before this agreement.
Yes.
And
the
yet,
only thing is they are negotiating. They are sitting down at a table and talking now.
And yet, and that's what makes me sometimes wonder just who CNI is trying to play to. Among the first things you say in your report from just a few months ago, we found the situation on the ground far better than we had anticipated in Gaza and Jericho.
That was true in June. Remember, this was just before Arafat came, and none of the Hamas people were out on the streets. It was a joyous time for the Palestinians because they could see the end of the occupation. They thought the end of the occupation was coming. But as soon as you left Gaza, or as soon as you left Jericho, and we were there, we interviewed some of the young men that had been released by the Israelis, but they wouldn't let them go back to the West
because
Bank.
They put them in new prisons. One's called Jericho's, one's called Gaza.
That's right.
And they've got now Palestinian prison guards called the PLO.
Crazy. Well, you know, the problem, as we told Perez, we said the problem is with the IDF. They are like a trained German shepherd that can never learn to be, shall we say, friendly to the Palestinians.
And the good guy, bad guy routine that came forward. And Perez told us that things are getting better, he's working on it, it's not his fault.
But one member of the Knesset, when I complained to her about this in some detail and told her everything that had happened to us, and I said, and the Palestinians have a lot worse time than we do, she said, yes, we really should be more generous, shouldn't we? Now here we get back to, in a sense, the difference in approach by the two peoples, the Palestinians with their Islamic and Christian tradition, and the Israelis with their primarily Jewish tradition.
Post-Holocaust Jewish tradition.
All right, fine. Israel Shahak, you know, in his new book describes this in some detail.
This is what came out of the ashes of the ghettos and the furnaces.
You can say that. But
and to a certain extent, although my fellow Jews don't like it when I say things like this, but I feel it's accurate, Hamas is coming out of the ashes of Palestine.
Yes. Yes, very much so.
These are people whose every family has a horror story. Every family can tell you of people tortured, of relatives killed, of people subjected to humiliations that are despicable.
One of the things I'd like to say on this, because this will be seen by a lot of people, CNI is looking for American Arabs, particularly American Israeli Arabs who have a claim on Israeli citizenship, and who have been either tortured or who have suffered in some fashion or other, because we would like to start a class action suit to end aid on the basis that it is going to...
Just go talk to B'Tselem in Ramallah. They've got records that go back for years already.
You mean Al-Haq in Ramallah?
Well, Al-Haq in Ramallah, but B'Tselem in wherever it's located.
Down there.
I have been there when American citizens have been killed in cold blood, and American embassy officials were not even allowed into the homes of these people unless they were accompanied by Israeli officials. I mean, the whole situation has gotten to the point, and this is something the American people don't know at all. They hear Hamas, they hear terror, they hear the World Trade Tower is blown up, they hear on this program that Memorial Bridge was under threat and was closed down. What they don't hear is where these young people come from, what their experiences are, how they've been forced into a life of confrontation, of extreme bitterness, of extreme cruelty.
Still being provoked.
But now it's even worse. Now they're being provoked by the remnants of their own organization that was led by Yasser Arafat to a terrible surrender. And then he got up on the White House lawn pretending that it was something other than a surrender, and essentially he's been hired, Rabin says it all the time, essentially Arafat's been hired to put down his own people.
Although Rabin also said, well, you can't really blame him for some of the things that have happened on the West Bank and so on, because they haven't yet taken over there. You know, I wonder if they'll ever be able to take over.
They're never going to, they're never going to take over.
Well, then, you know, we're in the middle of a civil war, and we should not be on one side in that civil war, and we should end aid.
Well, now we're getting to the realities of the situation. Why are we on that side? When this all started in the 40s The Secretary of State, the most popular Secretary of State in memory, George Marshall, was
a great man.
Vehemently opposed to Truman's policy of recognizing Israel. In fact, he almost resigned over it.
Yes, that's true.
Then we went through the 50s and the 60s, in which the Israelis and the Arabs kind of fought it out. There were all kinds of deals under the table. It was only after the '67 war that the United States got in the business of serious armament and serious aid to Israel. Before that, the French and others were involved. All right, here we are. We're right in the smack dab of a civil war. But it's not just a civil war that takes place in Israel and Palestine. That civil war has destroyed Beirut. It's destroyed Baghdad. There's been a revolution in Iran. The Saudi regime is very worried. The Egyptians have been turned from a society that 20 years ago was relatively passive, relatively easygoing, very little real violence in Egypt of those days, to a society where people are being hanged and killed practically every week. So this civil war is multi-tentacle. It's not one group against another. There's all kinds of groups all over the place, and everything is intertwined, which makes the Middle East extremely difficult to discuss for a population of Americans, most of whom don't get over there.
I think the Americans understand it very well. We did a poll, you know, in September about this whole thing, and we were amazed that 62% of the American males between 35 and 54 who were given the credit for electing the Republican Congress this time. It was U.S. males between those ages. They were 62% for ending aid to Israel as soon as possible. And the general population, 53%.
But they also would have been 62% against ending foreign aid in general to just about everybody.
No, for ending foreign aid, but not
for
against.
ending, yes.
Yeah, for ending. Well, yes, that's possible, but we had some very specific questions, and it's a fascinating poll because it went across the board, Baptists, Catholics, all of these various interest groups.
How did the Jews come out in this?
Well, there were 6% who said more aid should be given to
6% of the poll results.
6% of the poll
Which
results.
happens to correlate to the percentage of Jews in the population.
No, about 3 in the population. About 3. The rest are probably friends of Israel, pro-Israeli.
All right. But that's not really so startling. The idea in this country of foreign aid handouts has never been very popular.
No, that's true. Lee Hamilton, we quote him in some of our material here. Lee Hamilton told us in June when we raised this idea of cutting off aid to Israel. Well, he said, if you cut off aid to Israel, there'll be no aid at all. Well, you know, as a Foreign Service officer who has seen some good things out of U.S. aid on occasion, but who has some real questions and doubts about it also, I wouldn't think that would be such a terrible thing. I think we could get along with no foreign aid.
Let's go back to CNI for a moment. On the whole, but let's be realistic about this, you're not a political force. You're a voice.
That's true.
Right. AIPAC is a political force.
That's right.
Right. So we're dealing with the apple-oranges phenomena. And it's important to let people know that. There is no force. There is no counter-force. There are only some counter-voices.
Yes. I think you're quite right about that. We're trying to get a debate started. We're trying to get people out of the closet. You know, people up on the Hill, when they talk to me, they will say, yes, Israel has to get along without U.S. aid. She's been using U.S. aid for all of these nefarious purposes. Not all of them are nefarious, but a lot of them are. And her capability of confronting the Palestinians on the ground and taking their land and building settlements is based entirely on U.S. aid. And that has to end. They say it. They say it to me. A senator said it to me.
Even if it ended today.
But they don't want to come out of the closet.
Even if it ended today, 73% of the territories have been taken. East Jerusalem, Arab Jerusalem, has been shriveled and is surrounded on all sides by Jewish settlements.
Yes.
We're not dealing with something that can be stopped through a small change or even by an end to aid. We're talking about something that needs to be reversed.
But isn't the point that, in fact, Israel will never sleep comfortably in the Middle East until she makes a real peace agreement with the Palestinians? I think you'd agree with me on that.
We've been talking today with Gene Bird, He's the president and executive director, I believe, of the Council for the National Interest. It's an organization that was set up about 5 years ago. It's an organization that is a voice for the things you've heard, not a political force. I'm glad we discussed it in those terms. And,
not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. And we thank him very much for letting us come down to the offices of the Council this afternoon for, I think, a forthright discussion about these issues. And we hope that you'll tune in next week on this channel at the same time, same day of the week, for another episode of Mideast Realities.